The morning they came to take her land, Elsie Cooper stood on the porch of the only home she had ever known and decided that she would not cry, not today, not in front of them, not for anything in this world. The sun had barely cleared the ridge line above Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, and already the dust was rising in thin orange columns along the main road. Elsie could hear the horses before she could see them, that familiar percussion of hooves against dry earth, and she pressed her hand flat against the porch railing and breathed the way her mother had taught her, slow and deep, the kind of breathing that keeps the body upright when the heart wants to fold. She was 31 years old. Her husband, Thomas Cooper, had been dead for 4 months. The debts he had left behind were not small ones. Thomas had been a good man in many ways. He had loved her fiercely and worked the land with the particular stubbornness of someone who refuses to let the earth win. But he had also borrowed against the farm twice in the last 2 years of his life. Once to replace the roof after a hailstorm tore through in the summer of 1880, and once to buy seed stock after a drought burned the first harvest to nothing. The lender was a man named Harlan Briggs, who ran the only bank in Caldwell and who wore his authority the way other men wore fine clothes, always visible, always pressed, always slightly too much. When Thomas died of a fever in January, Harlan Briggs had waited exactly 30 days before sending his first letter. By March, Elsie had received 4 of them. By April, she had received a notice that the property would be auctioned to satisfy the debt on the 15th of May, a Thursday, 10 o'clock in the morning, at the steps of the Caldwell courthouse. She had tried everything she could think of. She had written to Thomas's brother in Missouri, but the letter came back unopened, the address no longer valid. She had spoken with Reverend Holt at the Baptist church, who had prayed over her situation with great warmth and offered very little else. She had approached 2 of the neighboring ranch families, the Garfields and the Wheelers, and both had listened with genuine sympathy before explaining that their own finances were stretched thin by the same drought that had plagued the region for 2 seasons running. And so here she was, on the morning of May 15th, dressed in the dark blue wool dress she had worn to Thomas's funeral because it was her best dress, and she intended to face this with dignity, her hair pinned back cleanly, her chin elevated just enough to communicate that whatever they were about to take from her, they would not take her composure along with it. She had $47.16 in a small tin box on the kitchen shelf. It was every dollar she had in the world. She tucked the tin into her coat pocket, looked once at the farmhouse behind her, at the 2 windows that caught the morning light like open eyes. At the door she had painted blue the first spring she and Thomas had been married because she had always loved that color, and she walked down the porch steps and began the 1.5-mile walk into town. The road into Caldwell was well worn enough that the walking was easy, even in proper shoes. Elsie passed the Garfield fence line and the old cottonwood that had been split by lightning 3 summers ago and never fully died, still putting out leaves on one side every spring like it was making an argument against giving up. She thought that was something. She held on to it. The town of Caldwell in the spring of 1882 was a place of considerable noise and movement. It sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail, which meant that cattle drives still pushed through regularly, and the main street retained a particular roughness even as the newer brick buildings tried to suggest otherwise. There were 2 saloons, a general store, a blacksmith, a feed store, a hotel called the Meridian, a doctor's office, a barbershop, and the courthouse, which was the tallest building on the main street and had been built with aspirations that the surrounding territory had not entirely grown into yet. When Elsie reached the edge of town, she noticed the unusual number of people gathered near the courthouse steps. Word of a property auction in a town this size spread efficiently, the way all gossip spread, through the barber shop and the general store and the breakfast tables of every family within riding distance. There were perhaps 40 people gathered, some she recognized and some she did not. She kept her eyes forward and walked through the crowd with the kind of measured steadiness that required every ounce of self-possession she had. She heard a few murmured words as she passed. Some of them were kind. Some were the particular kind of pity that feels worse than cruelty because it carries no expectation of your survival. She did not look for Harlan Briggs immediately, but she found him anyway, because he was standing at the top of the courthouse steps with his hat in his hand, and an expression of professionally arranged regret that fooled no one who knew him. He was a compact man in his late 50s with silver at his temples and eyes that had learned to be pleasant without being warm. Beside him stood his associate, a younger man named Dale Pruitt, who handled the legal paperwork for Briggs and who carried a leather satchel at all times as if he feared being caught without documentation. The auction was set to begin at 10, and by the clock in the courthouse window, Elsie could see it was 5 minutes before the hour. She positioned herself near the front of the gathered crowd, not because she had any illusion that $47.16 would be sufficient to outbid anyone who came with real money, but because she had decided weeks ago that she would be present for this, fully and without flinching. This land had been her life. She would watch it be discussed with her eyes open. It was in the moments before the auction began that she first became aware of him. She noticed him the way you notice something that is slightly out of alignment with its surroundings, not because it is trying to draw attention, but because it simply does not fit the pattern of everything else. He was standing at the edge of the crowd, slightly apart from the clusters of neighbors and speculators, a tall man with dark hair worn a little long beneath the brim of a battered tan hat. He was perhaps in his middle 30s, broad through the shoulders, wearing a plain work coat over a blue shirt, his boots well used and his posture easy in the way of someone who spent most of their life outdoors. He was not particularly remarkable in any single detail, but there was something in the way he stood, patient and unhurried and quietly attentive, that made him difficult to look away from once you had noticed him. He was watching the courthouse steps with a steady expression, not the hungry interest of a speculator. Something else. Elsie looked away when Harlan Briggs cleared his throat and called the proceedings to order. The particulars of the debt were read aloud by Dale Pruitt in a flat, efficient voice. Thomas Cooper, deceased, had borrowed against the property at the rate established by the bank, and the outstanding debt including accumulated interest stood at $412. The property consisted of the farmhouse, the outbuildings including a small barn and a chicken coop, and the farmland comprising 116 acres of tillable ground on the eastern edge of Caldwell County. The minimum opening bid was set at $420. Elsie heard the number and felt the careful architecture of her composure test itself against the reality of it. $420. She reached into her coat pocket and closed her fingers around the tin box and kept her face absolutely still. Briggs opened the bidding. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Elsie became aware that the crowd was not behaving the way auction crowds usually behaved. People who had come with genuine interest in acquiring property at a favorable price were usually vocal and competitive. But the crowd around the courthouse steps was quiet, and several people she recognized, the Garfields' old missus. Hartley from the millinery, young Pete Soto who worked at the feed store, were looking at the ground or somewhere off to the side, as if they had decided that their continued observation of this particular event was not something they were comfortable with. Briggs repeated the opening bid. Still no response. Elsie felt something shift in the air around her. The quality of the silence was strange. It was not the silence of disinterest. It was the silence of people who had agreed, perhaps not in any formal way, but agreed nonetheless to not participate. And then she heard footsteps on the far side of the crowd, deliberate and unhurried, and the tall man with the battered tan hat moved through the cluster of people with quiet ease and stopped a few feet to Elsie's left, where he could see both her and the courthouse steps with equal clarity. Briggs looked at him with undisguised irritation. "We have an opening bid requirement of $420, he said, the words carrying the particular edge of a man who had expected this auction to be simpler. "Are there any bidders?" The tall man reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded envelope. He held it up without theatrical emphasis, just a clean, visible gesture. $420, he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the faint trace of something southwestern in the vowels, Texas or perhaps New Mexico, the kind of accent that belonged to someone who had spent years on the open range. Briggs stared at him. "That's the minimum. Is there anyone who wants to bid higher?" The silence stretched. No one else raised a hand. No one else spoke. Briggs looked around the crowd with the expression of a man who has miscalculated something important, and Elsie realized, in a rush of understanding, that the silence from the crowd had not been accidental. These were her neighbors. They had decided not to bid against her, not to participate in what they had assessed correctly to be an injustice dressed up in legal language. And the tall man had placed the single bid, and there was no one to raise it. "Going once," Briggs said, his voice considerably flatter than it had been. "Going twice." Dale Pruitt was making marks in his documentation with a stylus, his face carefully neutral. "Sold," Briggs said, with the tone of someone swallowing something unpleasant. "To the gentleman at $420. The crowd exhaled collectively, the kind of collective exhalation that contains something very close to relief. Elsie was not breathing at all. The tall man walked toward the courthouse steps and handed over the envelope. Briggs opened it, counted the notes inside with practiced hands, and turned to Pruitt with a few murmured words. Pruitt opened his satchel and produced a legal document, which was signed and witnessed in the space of several minutes while the crowd waited and Elsie stood in place and tried to understand what she was watching. And then the tall man turned and walked back through the crowd directly toward her, holding a piece of paper in his hand. He stopped when he was standing before her, close enough that she could see clearly the particular shade of his eyes, which were a deep gray-green, the color of sage after rain. He held out the document. "Mrs. Cooper," he said. She looked at the paper without taking it. "I don't understand," she said, and her voice came out more carefully controlled than she expected. "It's the deed," he said simply, "to your farm." She looked up at him. "You paid $420 for a deed, and you are handing it to me." "That's correct." "Why?" It was not quite a question. It was the particular word of someone who has encountered something they cannot yet categorize as real. He looked at her steadily, without performance, without the particular gloss that men sometimes put on acts of generosity to make sure the appreciation landed correctly. "Because it's yours," he said, "and it should stay that way." Elsie took the deed from his hand. The paper was substantial and warm from being in his coat pocket, and she pressed it between both palms and felt something in her chest perform a complicated, unsteady movement that she was not prepared for. She had told herself she was not going to cry, and she kept that promise, but it required more from her than she had budgeted. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't. My name is Clyde Quinn. I have a horse ranch about 6 miles northeast of town. I've been in this county about 2 years." He paused. "I knew Thomas a little. We shared a fence line for about half a mile. He was a decent man." "He was," she said. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." She looked at the deed in her hands and then back at him. "Mr. Quinn, this is an extraordinary amount of money. I cannot accept this without some arrangement for repayment. I will repay you. It may take time, but I will do it." Something moved across his expression. Not amusement exactly, but something quieter, something that might have been the early version of a smile that had not decided whether it was welcome yet. "I didn't come here today expecting repayment," he said. "I'm sure you didn't," she said. "But that is the arrangement I am offering, and I would prefer it to the alternative." "Which is?" "Feeling like something you did out of pity," she said, and the honesty of it surprised even her. He was quiet for a moment, and the crowd around them had begun to shift and disperse, people moving away in small groups. some glancing back at the two of them with the openly curious expressions of people who understood they were witnessing something that would be discussed at supper for a week. Briggs and Prewitt had retreated up the courthouse steps and were engaged in their own unhappy conversation. "It wasn't pity," Clyde Quinn said finally. "It was something else." He did not elaborate on what that something else was, and she did not ask, not right then, because there were only so many extraordinary things a person could absorb in a single morning. "Then we have an arrangement," she said. She extended her free hand and he shook it, his grip firm and direct without being excessive, the kind of handshake that communicated respect. "I will need to determine what terms are reasonable, given what the farm earns in a good season." "There's no rush," he said. "There is," she said. "I have been living under debt for 4 months. I find I would rather not continue that way." That expression crossed his face again, the one that was close to a smile. "All right," he said. "No rush, but sooner rather than later." "Exactly," she said. She walked home with the deed in her coat pocket, her hand pressed over it the whole way, and she did not let herself think too hard about Clyde Quinn until she was inside the farmhouse with the blue door closed behind her and the tin box back on the kitchen shelf. Then she sat down at the table and looked at the deed for a long time, and thought about a man with gray-green eyes who had said it was yours and should stay that way. And she felt the particular ache of someone who has just realized that the world contains more tenderness in it than they had recently been able to believe. The first time she went to his ranch was 3 days later, on a Saturday morning, with a ledger book under her arm and the particular manner of someone conducting official business. She had written down the farm's expected income based on the last 3 years of yields, accounting for the drought that had reduced the last 2 seasons below average, and arrived at a number she thought was honest and reasonable. She had also made a list of questions, because Elsie Cooper had found over the years that she thought better when she had a list. The Quinn Ranch was 6 miles northeast of town, as he had said, reached by a road that curved through a long, shallow valley, and then rose slightly onto better ground where the grass came in greener and thicker than it did on the lower flats. The property was different from her farm in character, where her land was cultivated and sectioned for crops. His was open and rolling, with wooden fencing that cut the land into pastures, and in the near pasture, a dozen horses moved in the easy way of animals that had not been frightened recently. The house was smaller than her farmhouse, a single-story structure of weathered timber with a covered porch, simple and functional, a man's house in the particular sense that it had been built for shelter rather than for home. But the porch boards were solid and the windows were clear, and there were flowers growing in a rough clay pot near the front steps that had no business being there in any practical sense, and which she noticed with some interest. He came out of the barn when she rode up. He was wearing work clothes and had clearly been in the middle of something, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, but he did not rush or apologize for his appearance, just walked toward her with the unhurried directness that she was beginning to think might be a consistent feature of the man. "Mrs. Cooper," he said. "Mr. Quinn." She swung down from her horse, a steady brown mare named Bess, and tied her to the fence post. "I've brought my ledger. I would like to discuss the repayment arrangement." He looked at the ledger book. "All right. Come inside, I'll make coffee." She hesitated. It was not entirely appropriate for a widow to walk into an unmarried man's house without another person present, and she was aware of that. But the practical side of her registered that they were in plain view of the road, and that she was here for a financial discussion, and that Caldwell was not the kind of place where rigid propriety survived much contact with actual frontier living. She followed him inside. The interior of the house was clean in the particular way of a man who had decided that cleanliness was easier than disorder, and had simply committed to it. There was a main room with a table and 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelving with a few books and some practical equipment, and a second doorway that led to what was presumably the sleeping quarters. On the table there was a coffee cup already half full and a folded newspaper from 3 days ago. The flowers in the clay pot outside were repeated inside in a smaller form, a single dried wildflower in a tin cup on the windowsill, which struck her as unexpectedly careful. He made coffee on the stove and set a cup in front of her, and sat down across the table with the uncomplicated ease of someone who was comfortable in their own space, and extended that comfort to guests without making a production of it. She opened the ledger. The farm has averaged 43 acres under cultivation in good years, closer to 35 in the last 2 seasons. At current grain prices, a full harvest on 40 acres brings in roughly $300 net of seed and labor costs. I propose to pay you $40 per year, which would retire the debt in approximately 11 years, with the understanding that in better harvest years I may accelerate the payments. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and listened to all of this without interruption. "That seems reasonable," he said when she was done. "I thought so. 11 years is a long time." "I'm aware of that," she said. "If you have a counter-proposal, I am prepared to hear it." He looked at his coffee cup. There was something in the quality of his silence that she had begun to notice, the way he thought before he spoke, not out of hesitation exactly, but out of a kind of respect for the weight of words. "No counter-proposal," he said. $40 a year with the option to accelerate. I can have Pruitt draw something up formally." "Please," she said. "I prefer things in writing." "So do I." She closed the ledger. The coffee was good, strong and plain, and the kitchen was very quiet except for the sound of the horses in the pasture. She found herself looking at the dried wildflower in the tin cup on the windowsill, and thinking about the clay pot of growing flowers on the porch, and then she thought it was probably none of her business. "What kind of horses do you raise?" she asked, because the conversation needed somewhere to go and she was genuinely curious. Something changed in his expression. Not the near smile this time, but something fuller and more immediate, the particular animation of someone asked about the thing they love most in the world. "Quarter horses primarily," he said. "Working stock for ranches. I've been developing a bloodline for the last several years that handles cattle work well. Good temperament, solid build, fast acceleration." He paused. "I brought a stallion up from Texas 2 years ago that I think is going to prove out. He's in the back pasture." "Thomas always said quarter horses were the most practical breed for this country," she said. "He was right about that." They sat with that for a moment, Thomas's name settling into the room without making it smaller. "How long were you married?" Clyde asked. He said it simply, without the tiptoe quality that most people used when they mentioned Thomas around her. "Years," she said. "We came out from Illinois together in '72, when Thomas decided he wanted to farm his own land rather than someone else's. He was 26 and I was 19, and we thought we knew more than we did, but we learned the rest as we went." She paused. "He was 35 when he died." "Too young," Clyde said. "Yes." He did not offer anything beyond that, no platitude, no reassurance, just the simple acknowledgement. She appreciated it more than she could have explained. She stood and gathered her ledger. "I'll leave you to your work. I expect Pruitt can have the document ready by the middle of the week. I'll speak to him Monday," he said. He stood when she did, which she noted, and walked her out to where Bess was tied at the fence post. She mounted and looked down at him in the morning light. The sun was fully up now, and the valley was bright, and the horses in the near pasture were moving in long circuits, enjoying the warmth, and the whole scene had a quality of unhurried, unashamed beauty that the plains could produce on its better days. "Thank you for the coffee," she said. "Any time," he said, and meant it in the simple, uncomplicated way that some people manage to mean things. She rode back to her farm and let the mare graze while she stood at the fence and looked at the field she needed to plow and the list of things that needed doing and the blue door of the farmhouse catching the morning light, and felt something she had not felt in 4 months, which was not happiness exactly, but was the forerunner of it, the first loosening of something that had been clenched very tight for a very long time. The formal agreement was signed at Pruitt's office on Wednesday. Clyde was there, and Elsie, and Pruitt served as witness, and the whole thing took about 20 minutes. Afterward, on the boardwalk outside, Clyde looked at the street and then at her and said, "Have you eaten?" And she said she had not, and they walked to the lunch counter at the Meridian Hotel and ate beef stew and cornbread, and talked for an hour and 15 minutes about things that had nothing to do with debts or farms or deaths. He told her about growing up in Central Texas, near a town called Georgetown, the third son of a ranching family, how he had ridden for various outfits across New Mexico and Colorado before settling on the intention of running his own operation, how it had taken him 8 years to save enough to purchase the property northeast of Caldwell. She told him about Illinois, about her father who had been a school teacher and her mother who had grown a garden so elaborate and precise that the neighbors came to look at it, about the summer she was 16 when she had read every book in her father's collection, and then begun on the town library's collection, and had frightened the librarian with her pace. He listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he gave everything, which was to say complete and unhurried, the kind of listening that makes the person speaking feel that what they are saying is worth the space it takes up in the air. When they got to the door of the hotel and the afternoon was advanced enough that she needed to get back to the farm before dark, she paused and looked at him and thought, for the first time and quite clearly, that this was an unusually good man. Not in a soft sense, not in the sense of someone who had never been tested or challenged or asked to make hard decisions. Good in the sense of someone who had been all those things and come through them with his fundamental decency intact, and perhaps even strengthened by the friction of it. She said goodbye and rode home and thought about him all the way there, and was mildly irritated with herself for it, because she was a practical woman with a farm to run and 4 months of deferred maintenance to catch up on. And there was very little time in such a life for the particular luxury of thinking about a man with gray-green eyes who made strong coffee and listened carefully, and had paid $420 for a piece of paper he then handed to her on a courthouse lawn without making her feel small. But she thought about him anyway. That seemed to be the nature of the thing. The spring plowing season demanded most of her attention for the next 3 weeks. She had one old plow horse, a gray gelding named Hector who was reliable but slow, and the field she needed to get turned before the planting window closed was larger than she had managed alone in previous years, because Thomas had always helped with the heavy work. She hired Pete Soto's younger brother, a boy of 16 named Marcus, to help for 2 weeks, and together they turned the field in a slow and grinding campaign that left them both tired by evening and satisfied in the particular way of work that produces visible results. She saw Clyde Quinn twice during those 3 weeks, both times in town, once at the general store where they spoke for about 10 minutes about the relative merits of different corn varieties, and once on the street where they exchanged greetings, and he asked how the plowing was going, and she told him truthfully, and he nodded with the expression of a man who understood exactly what she meant. Both times, standing in those ordinary spaces having those ordinary conversations, she felt the same thing she had felt at the lunch counter, a warm and somewhat bewildering awareness that this man occupied more of her attention than was strictly warranted by their relationship, which was, after all, that of a woman and her creditor. It was near the end of May, on a Thursday evening, that the relationship shifted in a direction she had not entirely anticipated. She was carrying water from the well to the kitchen garden, the kind of repetitive late evening work that occupies the body while the mind moves freely, when she heard a horse coming up the road at a trot and looked up to see Clyde Quinn turning off toward her property at the fence line. He dismounted at the gate and called out, "Is this a bad time?" "It's fine," she called back, setting down her bucket. "Come through." He tied his horse and came through the gate and looked at the kitchen garden, and then at her, with the bucket and the particular dishevelment of someone who has been working since before sunrise. "I was riding back from town," he said, And I noticed your fence line along the east field has a section down, 3 posts. If you've got spare posts, I can put them in while there's still light." She looked at him. He had come through a long working day and was offering to fix her fence in the last 2 hours of daylight because he had noticed it needed doing. "I have posts in the barn," she said. "Show me where." They fixed the fence together in the warm gold light of the late afternoon, working side by side with the efficient rhythm of 2 people who both know how to do a physical task. He dug and she held the posts and then reversed, and they strung the wire and tamped the ground, and when the last post was set and solid, he stepped back and looked at the work and she stepped back beside him and looked at it too. "That'll hold through the summer," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for noticing and coming back." "It would have let your stock into the east field," he said, as if this were explanation enough. "I know, still." She looked at him sideways. "Would you like supper?" "I have a pot of beans on and cornbread I made this morning." He looked at her with that careful, unhurried attention. "Yes," he said, "I would." They ate at the kitchen table with the windows open, and the evening air coming through and the lamp turned low, and the conversation found its own level the way water does when given enough space, moving easily through topics and occasionally landing somewhere unexpected. He told her about a foal that had been born that week, a gray colt out of the bloodline he was developing, who had stood up within the hour and already showed the conformation he had been trying to produce. His face, when he talked about the horses, had that particular quality of a person in their element, and she found she could have listened to it for considerably longer than the meal lasted. When he stood to go, he picked up his hat from the peg near the door and turned it in his hands for a moment before putting it on. "Mrs. Cooper," he said. "Elsie," she said, "you've fixed my fence and eaten my beans. I think we can dispense with Mrs. Cooper." Something genuine and warm moved through his expression. "Elsie," he said, "I would like to call on you, formally if that suits you, not as anything related to the debt or the farm." He paused. As a man who would like to spend more time with a woman he finds very much worth spending time with. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the open window, the first crickets were beginning their evening noise, and somewhere distant a whippoorwill was calling in its repetitive, earnest way. She looked at him steadily. She had spent 31 years learning her own mind, and she knew it well enough to be honest with it. What she felt when she was near this man was not gratitude, or not only gratitude, it was something older and more insistent than that, something that had its own logic independent of what he had done for her at the auction. "That suits me," she said. He put on his hat. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she said. He walked out into the evening, and she stood at the kitchen door and watched him untie his horse and ride away down the road in the long blue dusk, and the feeling in her chest was not complicated at all, which was, after everything, a considerable relief. Sunday he came with his good shirt on, and a small bunch of purple wild verbena that he had clearly picked from the roadside on the way over, held with the particular unself-consciousness of a man who does not feel that flowers require apology. They walked along the creek that ran through the southern edge of her property, a slow green thread of water bordered by willows that were just coming into their full summer leaf, and they talked in the easy, ranging way of 2 people who have discovered they are interested in the same things, not identically, but compatibly. He asked her about her father's books, which ones she had read and which had meant the most, and she told him about George Eliot, and he admitted he had not read her, and she said she would lend him the copy of Middlemarch she had carried from Illinois, and he said he would read it, and she believed him. She asked him about Texas, and he told her stories of the trail drives he had ridden in his 20s, the particular kind of exhaustion and freedom that comes from a month on horseback moving cattle north, the friendships that form under that kind of shared hardship, and the way they stay with you even when everything else changes. He told her about a vaquero named Ignacio who had taught him to read cattle the way other men read weather, by small signs and accumulated observation, and who had told him that the best horsemen listen more than they speak, which had been, Clyde said, not entirely inapplicable to other areas of life. She laughed at that, and the laugh was a real one, unguarded and clear, and he looked at her when she laughed with an expression that she felt all the way to the back of her. They sat by the creek for a while in the comfortable silence of people who have figured out that silence between them is not a problem to be solved, but a kind of ease to be enjoyed. The willows moved in the light wind and the water went over the stones in its particular voice, and a red-winged blackbird landed on a branch not far away and regarded them without concern. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The morning of the auction, you said it wasn't pity. What was it?" He was quiet for a while. Not avoiding the question, she could tell, just finding the honest answer in the territory of himself. "I had ridden past your farm maybe 30 times in 2 years," he said. "I'd seen you working in the field and in the kitchen garden and talking with Thomas when he was out checking fences. I didn't know you. We'd exchanged maybe a dozen words in total." He paused. "But when I heard what Briggs was doing, I knew it was wrong. Not just unfair, but wrong in a way that felt like it should not be permitted to happen unchallenged. And I had the money from a horse sale the week before, and I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" she said quietly. "I thought that a woman who had worked that land for 9 years and buried her husband there, and was standing at the top of those courthouse steps with her head up like nothing in this world was going to break her deserve to keep what was hers." He looked at the creek. "And I thought I would like to know her." Elsie looked at the water moving over the stones. She thought about the morning of the auction, about the exact measure of effort it had required to hold her head at that particular angle, about the $47.16 in the tin box that she had pressed her hand over on the walk into town, as if contact with it could make it larger than it was. "I was terrified," she said. "I was absolutely terrified, and I was not going to let any of them see it." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean." They looked at each other in the filtered afternoon light under the willows, and something that had been carefully maintained at a conversational distance between them closed itself without ceremony, the way certain distances do when the right words have been said and there is nothing left to pretend. He called on her the following Sunday, and the one after that, and the pattern of their Sundays became something both of them looked forward to with the particular anticipation that good things generate. They walked the creek and the fields and once rode together out to the far edge of his property to look at the new bloodline stallion, a big chestnut with an easy eye that Clyde called Bonanza, and she stood at the fence and watched the horse move and understood completely what he meant about the quality of the animal. Through June and into July, the thing between them deepened in the way of natural phenomena, incrementally and then all at once. There was the Sunday in late June when they were sitting on her porch in the long evening, and he reached across and took her hand, simply and without announcement, and held it, and she turned her palm to hold his back, and nothing else was said about it because nothing needed to be. There was the July afternoon when a line of thunderstorms rolled through the valley, and she was trying to get the horses in from the pasture, and the rain came before she had finished, and he appeared out of nowhere, hat pulled down, moving efficiently through the gate to help her without a word of explanation for how he had arrived, and afterward they stood in the barn door watching the rain come down in silver sheets, while the horses stamped and settled around them, and he said, "Are you cold?" And she said, "Not especially," and he put his arm around her shoulders anyway, and she leaned into him, and the barn was warm and dry, and the rain was doing what it was supposed to do, and it was very simple and very good. He had read Middlemark by the 3rd Sunday in July, and they talked about it for most of the afternoon walk, which was one of the better conversations she could remember having. And at the end of it he said, "Dorothea reminds me of you," and she said, "In which respect?" And he said, "In the sense of someone who is capable of much more than the circumstances immediately around her allow." And she was quiet for a moment because no one had said anything quite like that to her in a very long time. She gave him her other George Eliot after that, and he read it in a week and a half. It was on a Saturday evening in early August, when he had come for supper and they were sitting on the porch after the dishes were done, with the dark coming down softly and the stars beginning to assert themselves over the flat horizon, that she told him about the miscarriage, the only pregnancy of their 9-year marriage, 4 years in, the child they had not had. She told him without planning to, without having decided in advance that this was something she would say, just because the conversation had moved in that direction and she trusted him with it. He listened without moving, without the kind of uncomfortable shifting that grief makes some people do. When she had finished, he said, "I'm sorry. That's a very heavy thing to carry," and she said, "It was for a long time. Less so now, but it never disappears entirely," and he said, "No, I imagine it wouldn't," and that was enough. She asked him, somewhere in the pause after, whether he had ever been close to marriage, and he said once, years ago, a woman in Colorado who had decided in the end that a horse rancher's life was not the life she wanted, and that he had understood even while it was painful, and that he thought she had been right to make the choice she made because the alternative would have made them both unhappy. "You're not bitter about it," she observed. "No," he said. "It was a long time ago and she made the honest choice." "That's better than the alternative. You believe in honest choices," she said. "I think they're the only kind that don't come back to cause trouble," he said. The stars were full out now, the Milky Way visible as a broad pale band across the dark. She had lived on the plains long enough to know the sky in the way people know landscapes they have spent years inside, and it still astonished her, the sheer abundant generosity of it. "Clyde," she said. "Yes. I think I have developed quite strong feelings for you." She said it directly, because she was a direct person, and because she had learned that honesty in these matters was better than the alternative, and because he had said the same thing about honest choices not 30 seconds ago. He was quiet for one beat, and then he said, "I was wondering when you'd say it first. I've had them for considerably longer than I've known how to explain." She turned to look at him, and he turned at the same moment, and in the dark of the porch, with the stars doing their vast, indifferent work overhead, he kissed her for the first time, and it was not a tentative kiss, not the careful exploratory gesture of two people unsure of their welcome, but a full and certain one, the kind that comes from having thought about it long enough to know exactly what it means. She held her hand against his jaw for a moment afterward, and he looked at her in the dark with an expression she had never seen on any face before but recognized instantly. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had not expected this, had not been looking for it, and was profoundly glad she had found it anyway. August moved into September, and September was the best month of the year on the plains. The heat broken, the sky going a deep, impossible blue, the grasses turning gold and the cottonwoods going yellow along every creek and draw. The harvest came in better than she had projected, the extra rain in June having made up some of what the last 2 drought years had taken, and she pulled her corn in with Marcus Soto's help, and sold it at a price that let her send Clyde $60, 50 of which he tried to return and she refused to accept back. "It's what we agreed," she said, standing in the road between the properties with her hand out. 40 for the year plus 20 accelerated. We agreed I could accelerate." "I know what we agreed," he said. "Then take the money, Clyde." He took the money, but he looked at it in his hand with the expression of a man who is going to continue to think about this. The question of what exactly their future looked like had been sitting between them in a comfortable but increasingly present way since August. They were both practical people who believed in honest choices, and the honest choice in this situation was fairly clear to both of them. But there was the matter of the farm and the matter of the ranch, and the matter of how those two things fit together, which required some actual thought and discussion rather than just the acknowledgement of feeling. He raised it on a Sunday in October, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee, in the direct way that had become one of the things she valued most about him. "I want to marry you," he said. "I've wanted to say that for a while. I am saying it now because I think we are both too practical to let the obvious thing go unsaid for too long." She looked at her coffee cup and then at him. "I want to marry you too," she said. "I've been thinking about the practical side of it." "So have I. "The farm is mine and I intend to keep farming it," she said. "The ranch is yours and the horses are your life's work. The question is how to manage both." "I've been thinking," he said, "that 6 miles is not a long distance for a man on a good horse. And I've been thinking that the horse operation doesn't need me present every hour of every day, particularly if I hire another hand, which I've been considering anyway. And I've been thinking," she said, "that 40 acres doesn't require the level of labor it once did with better equipment, and that some of the land I'm not currently farming could serve as additional pasture." They looked at each other. "So we would go between both properties," she said. "As needed," he said. "Yes." "That would work," she said. "I think so. I am also returning the outstanding debt before we marry," she said. "I want that settled before anything else." He opened his mouth and she held up her hand. "Clyde, I need it to be settled. I need to know that what happens next is entirely free of that particular beginning. Do you understand?" He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Yes, I understand. The harvest this year was good," she said. "I expect next year to be better. I can have the remaining $300 paid within 3 years at current yields." 2.5, he said. "The price on corn is going up. I've been reading the market reports." She looked at him. He had been reading the market reports on corn for her farm. 2.5, she agreed. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I would like you to know," he said, "that the money was never the point." "I know," she said. "That's why it matters to me that we settle it properly." He nodded. He understood. That was one of the things about him that she loved most, the way he could hold two true things at once without needing to resolve them into one. They were married in December of 1882 at the Baptist Church in Caldwell, with Reverend Holt officiating, and a congregation that included most of the people who had stood on the courthouse lawn in May and said nothing. The Garfields were there, and old Mrs. Hartley and Pete Soto and his brother Marcus and a dozen other people from the county, and also 3 men from Clyde's ranching days in Texas who had ridden up for the occasion, weathered men with good handshakes who clearly thought well of him. The ceremony was not elaborate. Elsie wore the blue dress that she had worn to the auction, a different blue dress from the funeral one, a softer color, the color of the door. She had added a piece of cream-colored lace at the collar that had been her mother's. She carried a small bunch of dried verbena, because the flowers were not blooming in December, but the dried ones kept their color, and they had a particular history between her and Clyde that made them better than any fresh arrangement would have been. He was wearing his best clothes, which were considerably improved by the haircut he had gotten the day before, and he looked at her when she walked down the aisle with the same expression he had worn on the dark porch in August, full and certain, and entirely without reservation. The vows were the traditional ones, and they said them in steady voices, and when Reverend Holt pronounced them, married, and Clyde kissed her in front of the congregation, there was a sound from the gathered people that was somewhere between applause and something more fundamentally relieved, as if the county itself had been holding its breath since May and had only now let it out. The small reception afterward was held at the Meridian Hotel, where the proprietress, a capable woman named June Aldrich who had developed a strong opinion about this wedding over the preceding months, had organized a meal of roasted beef and sweet potatoes and 3 different kinds of pie, which was extraordinary by the standards of the time and the place, and which June accepted compliments on with a graciousness that implied she had known all along this was what was going to happen. Clyde danced with her. She had not expected him to be a dancer, and he was not a polished one, but he was willing, and he kept time well enough, and he held her as if he was genuinely glad to have his arms around her rather than as if dancing were an obligation to be discharged. They danced 3 times, and the 3rd time the fiddle player, an old man from the south of the county named Mr. Archuleta, played something slow and sweet that Elsie had never heard before, but which she decided immediately she would remember for the rest of her life. They went to the ranch that night because the house was larger, and in the morning they woke to a clear, cold December day and walked out to see the horses and Bonanza, The chestnut stallion came to the fence and breathed warm air onto her palm, and she fed him a piece of the cornbread she had wrapped in paper the night before. And Clyde watched her with the expression she now knew well, warm and quiet and fully present. The debt was fully repaid, as she had said it would be, in the fall of 1885, 23 months ahead of the projected timeline, the harvest having come in better than either of them had estimated for 3 consecutive years. She brought the final payment to Dale Prewitt's office in person and watched him stamp the paperwork as settled, and felt something that was not only relief but a particular kind of pride in the straightness of it. She told Clyde that evening. He took her hands in both of his and said, "I know you needed that," and she said, "I did," and they said nothing more about it because nothing more needed saying. The years between the wedding and the arrival of their first child were good years in the particular way that foundational years are good, years in which the architecture of a life is built with care and attention, and the satisfaction of construction. They managed both properties as they had planned, going between the farm and the ranch as the seasons required, spending most nights at the ranch as the house expanded to accommodate their life together. A new room added in the summer of 1884 by Clyde and Pete Soto's capable hands. The farm remained Elsie's, documented and undisputed, and she worked it with the systematic intelligence of someone who had learned by experience what the land needed and when, rotating crops, improving the soil with methods she read about in agricultural journals that came from Kansas City, producing yields that were consistently above the county average, and which attracted occasional puzzled respect from neighbors who had not initially expected that kind of result from a woman running land alone. Not alone, she would have corrected them, but the correction would not have addressed what they actually meant, which was a woman making the decisions, and on that point she would have simply let her harvests speak for themselves. In the spring of 1886, their son was born. He arrived in April during a rainstorm, attended by the Caldwell doctor and by June Aldrich, who had appointed herself midwife for this particular occasion and who was enormously effective in that role. He was a healthy, loud, opinionated child who came into the world as if he had plans and was impatient to begin executing them, and they named him James Thomas Quinn, the Thomas for the man whose land had become this child's inheritance in a way that felt right and true. Clyde held the baby with the same quality of attention he gave everything that mattered to him, which was to say completely and without distraction, and Elsie watched him hold their son and felt the particular fullness of a moment that is exactly what you hoped it would be, and then something beyond that. James grew into a boy who loved horses with the same instinctive passion as his father, and who showed early evidence of his mother's methodical intelligence, which Clyde said was the most useful combination of qualities he could imagine for a person who intended to do anything significant in the world. He was walking at 11 months and talking in full sentences by 2 years, and by 3 was attempting, with a seriousness that was difficult to argue with, to groom the most patient of the ranch horses under Clyde's supervision. Harlan Briggs left Caldwell in 1884. The circumstances were various and not entirely his choosing. There had been complaints filed about his lending practices, and the arrival of a second bank in town had made clear that his operation was not the only option it had once been, and he departed quietly on a Tuesday morning without making a ceremony of it. Caldwell did not, on the whole, make a ceremony of his departure either, but several people noted privately to each other that the air felt somewhat different afterward, which is the kind of thing people say when they mean that something unjust has been corrected by the ordinary workings of consequence. Dale Prewitt stayed and eventually became the town's primary notary, a role better suited to his skills than his association with Briggs had been, and he was notably helpful to Elsie over the years in keeping her farm's documentation in order. By 1887, the Quinn horse operation had expanded significantly. Bonanza's offspring were proving out exactly as Clyde had predicted, and the reputation of his bloodline had spread along the ranching networks that connect such things, bringing buyers from as far as Colorado and the Indian Territory. He hired 2 full-time hands, brothers named Roy and Danny Esperanza, who had come up from New Mexico, and who lived in the bunkhouse he built on the eastern edge of the property, and who were excellent with the horses and reasonably good company at a distance. Elsie reorganized the farm in 1887 to reduce the labor-intensive grain cultivation and increase the kitchen garden and orchard production, which required less physical labor and produced higher value per acre. She added 20 apple trees and a sizable kitchen garden that by 1888 was producing enough surplus to sell at the Caldwell market, and she began writing a column for the county agricultural newspaper called Notes from the East Field that became quietly popular with readers who found her precise, practical, and occasionally dryly funny observations more useful than the theoretical articles that usually filled the publication. She was 37 when she discovered she was expecting again, in the late summer of 1888. The doctor was encouraging. The pregnancy went smoothly through the winter, and in March of 1889 she gave birth to a daughter, Elsie Grace Quinn, who was smaller than James had been and who arrived with the particular serene efficiency of someone who has organized their entrance in advance. James, who was 3 years old and had been given careful advance notice of the situation, arrived at the bedside with an expression of thoughtful assessment and announced that the baby was acceptable. Clyde, hearing this report later, laughed with the unguarded fullness that Elsie had come to love most in him, the laugh that came out when something struck him as genuinely, unqualifiedly wonderful. Elsie grew and James grew, and the ranch thrived, and the farm thrived, and the years moved through their seasons with the particular depth and texture of a life being fully lived rather than merely endured. There were hard years, a drought in 1890 that hit the grain harvest hard and required some recalculation, a sickness that moved through the horses in the winter of 1891 and took 2 animals before the veterinarian from Wichita got ahead of it, a year when the apple trees produced almost nothing, and another when they produced so much that she was selling bushels to 3 different towns. Through all of it, the farm held and the ranch held and the family held, which is to say that the 2 people at the center of it held each other with the particular constancy of 2 people who understand that what they have built together is worth the maintenance. There were ordinary evenings that were among the best things in either of their lives. Summer evenings on the porch with James running in the yard and Elsie asleep inside, and the sky doing its extraordinary prairie work overhead. Winter evenings at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and books open, and the sound of the horses shifting in the barn. Mornings when they rode out together along the creek in the early light before the rest of the day claimed them, which they had made a regular practice of, and which they protected fiercely. He still brought her wildflowers, not every week, but regularly enough that she had started pressing them in the back of her journal, small flattened records of various Sundays and Saturdays and occasional Tuesdays when he had ridden past a hillside and thought of her. In the spring of 1893, with James a busy 7-year-old and Elsie a 4-year-old of tremendous opinions, Clyde came home from a cattle show in Wichita with news that the quarter-horse bloodline they had been developing was being formally recognized by the emerging registry organizations beginning to organize in the region, and that Bonanza's son, a gray horse they called Meridian after the hotel where he had first eaten supper with Elsie, had been purchased by a ranch in Colorado for a sum that represented the most significant single sale of his career. She read the details of it at the kitchen table and then looked up at him with an expression he recognized. "You've done it," she said. "What you came here to do. We've done it," he said. "It was your work," she said. "It was your farm that gave me stable ground to do it from," he said, "and your sense in it. You're the one who suggested the extended pasture in '86. That gave me room to expand the herd. The land should be used," she said, with the practical simplicity of someone who believed this completely. He sat down across from her and took both her hands on the table. "Elsie," he said, "when I rode into Caldwell on the morning of that auction, I had $420 in an envelope in my coat pocket and a fairly clear sense of what I was going to do with it, but no particular certainty about what came after." "And," she said, "and what came after was better than anything I had the sense to imagine," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the house they had extended and made together, with the sound of their children somewhere outside in the yard, with the horses moving in the pasture and the apple trees coming into blossom visible through the window. And she thought about a morning 11 years ago when she had walked into town with $47 and her head up and her heart clenched tight against everything she was afraid of. "I had been very afraid," she said, "that the best of things was behind me." "I know," he said. "I was wrong about that," she said. "Yes," he said, "you were." She squeezed his hands and he squeezed hers back. And outside in the yard James had gotten hold of Aliner's rag doll, and Aliner was delivering a comprehensive lecture on why he should return it immediately. And the apple blossoms were doing what apple blossoms do in the May light, which is to say opening with an extravagance that the prairie makes no apology for. And the kitchen was warm and the coffee was strong, and the world outside the window was green and gold and endlessly present. "James," Clyde called through the open window, "give your sister her doll." A pause, then, "She already has 3 dolls." "Give it back," he said, in the tone that was not raised and was not repeated and worked every time. Another pause. Then the sound of Aliner's lecture transitioning from accusation to satisfaction. Elsie laughed, and it was the real laugh, the unguarded one, and Clyde looked at her with the expression she had recognized on the dark porch in August of 1882, and which had not diminished 1 degree in the 11 years since. They sat at the table and drank their coffee, and listened to their children argue, with the comfortable reliability of people who know exactly where they are and have chosen it completely. James Quinn grew up to be a man of his father's patience and his mother's precision, a combination that made him an exceptional judge of horseflesh and an unusually good farmer, and he eventually managed the combined Quinn operation with a capability that exceeded both his parents' projections and made them quietly and openly proud. He married at 22, a woman from the southern part of the county named Ruth Castillo, whose family had been in Kansas for 2 generations, and the wedding was held at the Baptist church in Caldwell where his parents had married, with the same fiddle player somehow still playing, Mr. Archuleta having apparently decided that retirement was not for him. Aliner Quinn grew up to be something her mother had never quite been permitted to be in its fullest form, a formally educated woman. The Caldwell school having improved considerably by the time Aliner was of age, and the normal school in Emporia having become accessible to determined women of sufficient preparation. Aliner went at 16 and came back at 19 as a teacher, and she taught for 2 years in Caldwell before accepting a position in a larger school in Wichita, which she approached with the same efficient seriousness she had brought to the matter of the rag doll when she was 4 years old. She came home for Christmas every year without exception, and the Christmas dinners at the Quinn farm, which had long since become the ranch, and the farm merged in daily practice if not in legal documentation, were the kind of gatherings that grow naturally around people who have made a good place and know how to share it. The farm itself, the original 116 acres that Elsie had walked toward the courthouse to defend on a May morning in 1882, was deeded entirely and separately in Elsie's name, and remained so for the rest of her life, a fact that she had insisted on, and Clyde had supported without reservation because he understood, as he always had, exactly why it mattered. It was worked and productive and documented and undisputed, which was what she had needed it to be from the morning she had come home holding the deed that a man with gray-green eyes had pressed into her hands on the courthouse lawn. In the summer of 1895, they rode out together on a clear morning in June, the children both occupied elsewhere, just the two of them on the good horses along the creek line that marked the boundary between the farm and the southern pasture. The cottonwoods were in full summer leaf, enormous green presences along the water, and the creek was running higher than usual from the June rains, and the sound of it was constant and pleasant. They stopped at the place where they had first sat together by the water on that first Sunday 14 years ago. The willow that had been there was bigger now, truly large, its branches trailing in the current. Clyde dismounted and she dismounted beside him, and they stood at the water's edge the way they had stood here before, watching the water go over the stones. "I have been thinking," she said, "about writing something longer for the newspaper. Not just the column, something about the last 15 years. The farm, what I've learned, what works." "You should," he said. "Other women in this territory could use what you know." "I thought I might dedicate it," she said, "to T.C." And then a second dedication. "To who?" he said. She looked at him. "To the man who paid $420 for a piece of paper he didn't intend to keep," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You could just put the name." "I could," she agreed, "but I thought the context was worth including." He looked at the water. She knew that expression, the one that meant he was feeling something considerable and was taking a moment to find the language for it. "Elsie," he said. "Yes, I would like you to know," he said, looking at her now, "that the morning I rode into Caldwell with that envelope, I was not entirely certain what I was doing or why. I knew it was right. I did not know it was the beginning of everything." "Neither did I," she said. "I thought I was watching someone do something inexplicably kind. I did not realize I was watching the beginning of my life." The creek went on making its sound. The cottonwoods moved in the light wind. Somewhere up the draw, a meadowlark was singing with the complete confidence of an animal that has no doubts about the value of its song. He took her hand the way he had taken it the first time, simply and without announcement, and she turned her palm to hold his. And they stood by the creek in the June morning with the horses grazing behind them and the sky overhead doing what the Kansas sky always did, which was to be more generous with its light than seemed strictly necessary. And the world was full and real and entirely, completely theirs. She wrote the piece for the newspaper. It ran in 3 installments in the fall of 1895 in the Caldwell County Agricultural Courier, and was later reprinted in the Wichita paper, and generated more letters to the editor than the publication had ever received before, the majority of them from women across the territory who had read it and recognized in it something that belonged to them. She dedicated it exactly as she had said, to Thomas, who had started the work, and to Clyde Quinn, who had walked into an auction and handed her a deed, and in doing so had handed her more than either of them had known to ask for. The years continued to be good. Not without difficulty, not without the ordinary sorrows that any life accumulates over time, but good in the fundamental way, the way of lives built on honest choices and steady work and love that had not been manufactured from wishful thinking, but had grown from something genuine and been tended with the same attention they both gave to the land and the animals and everything else they had committed themselves to caring for. In 1897, a late November evening, 15 years after the auction and 12 days before their 15th wedding anniversary, they sat on the porch of the ranch house in the cold, clear air with blankets across their laps and the stars doing their winter work overhead, which was the same work they had always done and which never stopped being extraordinary. James was inside with Ruth and their 2-year-old son, another Thomas James Quinn II, who had arrived in the world with the same impatient energy as his father before him, and who was currently asleep on a blanket by the stove with the thoroughbred impracticality of very small children in warm spaces. Eleanor was in Wichita. She would come for Christmas. The ranch was quiet. The horses were settled in the barn. The farm to the south was put to bed for the season, the fields turned and resting, the apple trees bare and patient, the blue door of the farmhouse visible even at this distance in the moonlight, its particular color held even by starlight. Clyde put his arm around her and she leaned into him, which she had been doing for 15 years and which had never become routine in the sense of ordinary, only in the sense of home. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She considered the question. She was thinking about the morning she had walked into Caldwell with $47, and her head held high and her heart clenched against everything she was afraid of. She was thinking about a man at the edge of a crowd who had been watching with something other than the interest of a speculator. She was thinking about the weight of a deed pressed between her palms, warm from someone's coat pocket. She was thinking about coffee at a kitchen table and supper and fence posts in the last of the afternoon light, and a wild verbena in August, and a first kiss, and a wedding in December, and James arriving in April, and Alina arriving in March, and 11 and 14 and 15 years of a life that had been more than she had known how to hope for on the morning it began. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I am very glad you were there." He pulled her closer. "So am I," he said. The stars continued. The horses breathed in the warm dark of the barn. The little boy inside slept on, growing incrementally toward the future. The blue door of the farmhouse caught the moonlight and held it, the way it had always done, the way she had painted it to do in the first spring of the first marriage, when she had looked at a door and thought blue, because she had always loved that color and she was home. And the night went on around them, vast and generous and dark, and they stayed on the porch in the cold together until the cold got the better of comfort. And then they went inside to the lamp and the warmth and the quiet breathing of their grandson. And Clyde banked the stove, and she checked the blanket, and they looked at each other in the low lamplight with the easy, certain recognition of two people who have found the place they were meant to be and known it, and kept it, and built everything worth building inside it. The door of the Quinn ranch house was not blue. But in the morning, when the light came over the ridge at the angle, it always came in November, and fell across the floorboards of the room where she had first drunk coffee, across a table from a man who listened more than he spoke. The light itself was something close to that color, golden at the edge and soft at the center, the color of things that are both old and still entirely alive. And Elsie Cooper Quinn, who had once walked into an auction with $47 and her head held high, looked at that light and felt nothing incomplete. Everything was whole. Everything was hers. And the man sleeping behind the doorway to the next room was the reason for the better half of all of it, which she had told him once directly, which was the only way she knew how to tell anyone anything, and which he had received without deflection or modesty, but with the straightforward, uncomplicated fullness of a man who believed her and was glad to be believed. She put the coffee on the stove and listened to the ranch wake up around her, and the day came in through the windows exactly as days do when they belong to you completely, without apology and without end.